right. Well, thank you for your time. And in order to respect it, I suggest we get started right now. Thank you very much for being here again. Let's move on to the next slide, Iris, please. So, some important information before we start. Be aware, please, that this webinar is recorded. And the reason is because we want to give you the replay version after the webinar, and also because, unfortunately, some people notified us that they could not attend today, and they would like to view again, watch again this webinar in the future. Please use the Q&A system to ask your questions. You can do it during the presentation, but also, and most likely at the end of the presentation, you will have enough time to ask your questions. Avoid to unmute your microphone during the webinar, and it's just to guarantee a nice experience for everybody, to avoid any noise in the background. Feel free to open your camera, but also please remember that it's 96% of additional carbon emissions, so better to be ready right now, because maybe you will have to measure your CO2 emissions that you are emitting today next year for your carbon footprint report. Just a few words about who we are, and then I will hand over to Iris. So we are D-Carbonize. We are based in Brussels, right next to the European Commission, and I guess that's why this is what it motivates the webinar today about the European regulations. We are certified by the Solar Impulse Foundation as one of their solutions, and we are also compliant with global standards, being the one from the French government, ADEME, but also the one from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that maybe some of you are familiar with. At D-Carbonize, we develop a software to help companies to measure and reduce their CO2 emissions in order to obviously reduce CO2 emissions and implement a carbon reduction strategy, but also to comply with the coming regulations. And this is what we will be talking about today. We are very proud to be supported by solid investors that are accompanying us into our journey, and trusted by much more than now 40 customers in 12 different countries. And this webinar is an excellent opportunity as well to let you know that we are stepping into the US and opening an office in the US. So today I am very glad to be to have in the audience Sam. Maybe some of you know Sam Scheckman. He's our business developer for North America, and thank you very much to Sam for helping us to curate this wonderful webinar. And I also have the privilege to be with my colleague Iris. Iris is the Chief Compliance Officer of our company, and she's monitoring every day what's going on in the mind of our dear European Commission politicians that are designing the regulations that will impact our businesses as of January 2024. Iris has more than 10 years of experience as a lawyer, but also in finance and in compliance. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Fred. I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you as well to the audience. So Frederick John is a recognized leader in the decarbonization industry. He has a lot of experience with consulting firms and has conducted more than 100 carbon footprint assessment for clients. So he has a lot of knowledge, and I encourage you to ask as many questions as you can. So today's agenda, we are going to talk about the environmental awareness session, because it's important to understand the impact of human activity in the environment, and to understand why we do what we do and why we should avoid the impact that we have. We will continue with the implications of EU environmental laws. Then we will jump into a conclusion, and we will have some time for questions and answers. So
all right, well, I'll try in roughly 15 minutes to give a bit of a glimpse about why it is important to measure your CO2 emissions in light of global warming and in light of the coming regulations, because everything is connected, and I will try to make those connections for you today. So first things first, as you all know, you are familiar with this graph, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. and they are increasing since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because this is when we started to use massively fossil fuels. All right. But the thing is, we've experienced very recently a decrease at the global scale of those greenhouse gas emissions. And that was during COVID-19. During COVID-19, we reduced our CO2 emissions by 5.5%. Maybe you had another number in your mind, maybe 10%, 25%, but I will say that it decreased only by 5.5%. And please keep that number in mind, because that's really important to understand that that reduction for the future. The good news is CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are decreasing in specific regions. So that's the case in Europe. As you can see on the graph, we've decreased roughly by a third for the past 10 years. And in North America, CO2 emissions are also decreasing for the past 10 years. But the question is, where are emissions coming from? So the simple answer, it comes from our energy, mostly. Around 3/4 or 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted around the world on a yearly basis come from our energy consumption. And that's normal, because we are using a lot of fossil fuels to power our society, to power our cars, to power our industries, to power our home, to build our homes. So that's perfectly normal. But it's not all. You also have other sources of greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, forestry, land usage. So think about livestock, for example, because they are living things. They are also emitting quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and more specifically methane. But also because we are using lands in a different way, it can also create greenhouse gas emissions. It's also the case for waste. When you have landfills, well, you've got some reactions that create greenhouse gas emissions without the use of fossil fuels. And also in the industry. So, for example, we work with some industrial firms in the cement industry. And because you are, for example, burning rocks to produce cement, the CO2 that is captured in the rock, when it's burnt, it's released, and it goes directly into the atmosphere. Same for chemicals. You can have greenhouse gas emissions from chemicals that are not related to fossil fuels. So really what's important to understand here is that greenhouse gas emissions come from the energy that we use, because we use energy that is mostly based on fossil fuels. And what will be the future of our greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it will depend on us, to be honest. It will depend on our ambitions and our actions. And I guess that you are a bit aware of this future, otherwise you would maybe not be here today. So let me explain you the two opposites, right? The worst case scenario is we get around +5 degrees Celsius of global warming. +5 degrees is not ideal. It's a lot. It could be almost synonym to have a human life quite difficult to bear on our planet. And we would get there because we do nothing. You know, we have no regulation, no policies in place. So this is not, to be honest, the scenario where we are going to, but it's still possible at this stage. The other opposite is, well, what we voted, what we all agreed at the COP21, the Paris Agreements, with the different pathways. So you've got two of them. The first one is the 1.5 pathway degree, and the other one is to stay below 2 degrees of global warming. Now, remember about the COVID-19 effect on our greenhouse gas emissions. You remember I told you that we decreased by 5.5%. Well, if we want to stick to the pathways that were voted at the COP21 agreement, we will need to reduce every year by 5% our greenhouse gas emissions for the next 40 years, 4 decades. So the challenge is there. It's not impossible. We can still get there, even though with the increase of greenhouse gas emissions, it's getting every day a bit more difficult, but it's still possible. And this is this positive message that we need to keep. And to reduce our CO2 emissions, we need to start by measuring them. That's very important. So now, just a few insights about why did we decide to stay below 2 degrees of global warming? Why not 2.1 or why not 1.8? Why 2 degrees? Well, there is a simple reason behind that. Well, lots of different reasons, but one that is really important is that above 2 degrees of global warming, there will be some natural effects that will accelerate global warming, meaning that today global warming is mainly driven by the emissions related to human activities, while tomorrow there could be a cumulated effect where natural greenhouse gas emissions will be added up to our own emissions and will accelerate global warming. And that's exactly the same, for example, with permafrost. You know, it's a very famous example that we all know. Permafrost is melting due to global warming. And while it melts, well, it releases greenhouse gas emissions because thousands of years ago, when the permafrost was frozen, well, it captured greenhouse gas emissions. Just for your information, the definition of permafrost is that the layer that is underground and that is frozen for more than 2 years, then this is when you can call a region, a land, a surface as permafrost. And permafrost, in fact, it's a lot of lands. If you look at this map, it shows in different shades of blue the surface that is considered to be as permafrost, and it represents roughly 25% of the lands of North Hemisphere of our planet Earth. So it's a lot of lands, and it's potentially a lot of CO2 emissions, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that will be released over time. So now you understand the challenge is to reduce our CO2 emissions, right? But the thing is, and we like to mention in it, to repeat it, we cannot reduce what we do not measure. And the reality is our governments, companies, and even ourselves, we are navigating blindly. We are making decisions with the hope to reduce our CO2 emissions, but without the certainty that we are making a positive impact. And we are seeing so many times with companies, resources invested in projects with the good hope to reduce CO2 emissions, but because there was no diagnostic, resources were invested maybe not in the most efficient way and in the most appropriated location. And it's a bit like, I always use the same analogy, but it's true. A few years ago, I did a diet. And the first thing that I did when I started my diet was to buy a scale, because I wanted to measure where I was and to track my weight loss over time. And with CO2 emissions, it's exactly the same. You need to measure where you are in order to identify what you can do to track your reduction. Same for a doctor. You will never receive a medicine, or I hope you will never receive a medicine, if the doctor doesn't make a diagnostic first. And a carbon footprint assessment is this diagnostic so that you can have the appropriate treatment to reduce your CO2 emissions. And that's exactly what a carbon footprint is all about. But when we are talking about carbon footprint, you need to understand that we are measuring the greenhouse gas emissions that we need to measure to comply with the regulations and the standards that you need to follow to produce appropriate reports. And there are different greenhouse gas emissions. There are 4 of them. Carbon dioxide, which represents roughly 75% of CO2 of the greenhouse gases that exist in the atmosphere. You've got methane, nitrous oxides, and fluorinated gases. If you're not familiar with these last, these are the gases that you can find, for example, in your fridge, freezers, or air conditioning. And those gases are not present in a lot of quantity, but they are very damageable for our environment based on the power that these gases have to warm the atmosphere, their global warming effects. And scientists, a few years ago, well, they agreed that if we had to report all the different greenhouse gases on different reports, that would be very difficult and not very convenient. So they decided to convert everything into one single unit that everybody is familiar with, and that is carbon emissions, CO2. So to get CO2 equivalent, you need to convert methane into CO2. You need to convert nitrous oxides into CO2. And the way that you can do it is by taking into account the warming effect of the gas. And for methane, for example, well, it's 25 more powerful than CO2, meaning that if you emit 1 kilogram of methane, it has the exact same effect, the exact same greenhouse gas effect than 25 kilograms of CO2. And that's how you can make the conversion between one particular gas into CO2 equivalent. So to have a good carbon footprint reports, you need to follow two important rules. And the first one is to have a complete carbon footprint, and the second one is to have an accurate carbon footprint. So a complete carbon footprint will have 3 scopes. All right, so maybe you're familiar with them, but I will briefly repeat so that we are sure that everybody is at the same level. Scope 1, that would be your direct emissions. So literally, if you could see the greenhouse gases that are produced by your activities, that would be those gases. So fossil fuels that are used to heat your facilities, to power your machines, that you put in the cars that you are driving for your company. Those emissions from these fossil fuels will be reported into your scope 1. Scope 2, it's also related to energy, but these are indirect emissions. And the reason is because if you switch on the light where you are right now, or if you switch it off, the CO2 emissions will not be produced where you sit, but at the power station. And that's why it's an indirect emission, and it's reported in scope 2. There are other elements in scope 2, but it's basically energy for which the CO2, the greenhouse gas emissions, is emitted at the power plant. And then there is the scope 3, which is all the rest, divided into upstream emissions and downstream emissions. So you'll find different categories such as assets. So the greenhouse gas emissions related to the assets that are owned by the company, commute, going from where you live to the office, back and forth, business trips, plane, trains, cars, bus, whatever, your operating waste, so the waste that are from your production, your purchase. Most of the time that would be the services that you purchase or the raw materials that are purchased, logistics flows, inbound logistics flows. So the transportation of the goods that you purchase by air, by train, by boats, by truck, by van. And the same logistic flows needs to be measured for your downstream logistics flows. So when your product leaves your gates, you need to measure CO2 emissions related to that transportation to your customer and the customers of your customers. The product usage, that's a bit particular, but if you take, for example, the computer that maybe you have in front of you, or at least that I have in front of me, it requires electricity to work, right? Well, that electricity, the emissions related to the electricity should be reported into the carbon footprint assessment of the computer manufacturer. Same for a plane manufacturer, a car manufacturer, the kerosene or the diesel or the gasoline that you need to power the vehicle across its life should be reported there. End of life, well, if you keep the example of the computer, how this computer will end its life. Will it be recycled, incinerated, put into landfills? So the way that you will treat the end of life of your product will have an impact on your emissions. Franchise and investments, it's a bit particular. You will measure more or less the same elements. That would be the scope 1 and the scope 2 of your investments or of your franchises. So you need to collect those emissions from fossil fuel usage and electricity usage. And for that particular exercise, it's always good to have the right tool or right template to collect those data, because we may talk about thousands of customers or investees or franchises. If you want to see the official version of the previous slide that I showed you, is this one, where you have all the categories of the greenhouse gas protocol. I will not go into detail here because it's a bit too technical for the purpose of this webinar, but in other webinars, we will go through in each of these sections to really explain what it's all about and the technicalities of it. So I mentioned that we need to have a complete carbon footprint assessment, and one of the best ways to do that is by starting to map visually the flows, the activity flows of your activities. So it's literally everything that I mentioned, but that you will draw on a map, on a wall, on a whiteboard, and you will track everything you purchase, all the transportation, your facilities, your assets, your mobility. It's really helpful to visualize it so that afterwards you can come back to it, put the numbers that you collected, put the numbers that you converted into CO2 emissions, and it also helps you to identify who you should be speaking with to collect the data. So it's a very important tool to navigate across your carbon footprint assessment. And the other condition is to have an accurate assessment. And to do that, you need to focus on two variables. The first one is on the activity data, so the data that you will convert into CO2 emissions. So tons of plastic purchased, kilometers that are driven, kilowatt hour of energy that you use, and so on. And you convert them into CO2 equivalent with emission factors. And emission factors are available for free in lots of different databases, also against a subscription in other private databases. It depends on your need for your emission factors, but basically it's this ratio that will convert your quantity into CO2 equivalent, meaning you also have the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted to produce that product. The objective is what? Is to get this. And we get to the point of this webinar today. At the end of the day, it's to produce this report. So this is a screenshot from our product, where you can extract reports that are fully compliant with the different standards that we are supporting. As of next year, since there will be the CSRD will be live, we will also have a CSRD report. As soon as the Commission is has finally agreed on the final report, we will include that as well into the product. If you would like to go further, we strongly recommend this workshop, Climate Fresk. Maybe some of you know this workshop, but it's a wonderful tool to raise the awareness of your people and maybe of yourself and your team about the causes and the consequences related to climate change. So this is something we could organize for you, for your company, for your colleagues, but you can also find groups in New York City or in the US to get fresked, to participate to that workshop. So now let's dive into the core topic of today. Is that you understand now how greenhouse gas emissions are impacting our environment. You understand a bit now how to measure greenhouse gas emissions. And the European Commission, well, they know that if we want to reduce our CO2 emissions, we need to measure them. They know it very, very well. So this is why they decided to implement, as of January 2024, so in 2 months and a half from now, these new regulations that we will go through it. But basically, they want to be more stringent with companies to report their CO2 emissions on Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. I guess now is the time for me to pass the floor to the main speaker of today, Iris. Iris will lead you through the main climate laws that are being implemented in Europe and how we can expect those laws to impact American firms, even though they are not based in Europe, or even though they don't have an office in Europe. Iris, up to you.
Thank you, Fred. So indeed, we are seeing many new external pressures, not only coming from regulators, but also coming from customers, from investors, from your own staff, but especially regulation. And I think personally, we have to see it as a benefit and opportunity for companies. Maybe for those ones who are not under the scope of certain regulation, they can use the opportunity to gain competitive advantage and to comply with those laws that do not apply to them. And to those who are under the scope of these new regulations, they can take the opportunity to really to improve the resilience, to assess the value chains, to increase the motivation among their staff. So I think of course it creates an administrative burden, but at the same time we have to see it as an opportunity, as a business opportunity. So in today's agenda, there are many EU environmental laws that I could talk for hours, but I'm going to focus on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, in the EU Emission Trading System, and the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So the way that I will go through the presentation, I will explain you briefly 4 or 5 slides what each EU environmental law means for companies, and also what is the impact for US companies in particular. So before I talk about the CSRD, I would like to mention the TCFD. I think you might be familiar with this set of recommendations. They are actually being used by the European Union to create some of the current environmental laws in Europe. As I said, there's a set of recommendations, but some countries are making it part of their regulatory framework. So they have always this structure of governance, strategy, risk management, but they also include metrics and targets. So they include the recommendation to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3, and to also disclose targets to achieve a carbon reduction plan. Also in this context, we have a CDP, which is formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. The CDP is a standardized reporting system that is aligned with the TCFD. And we can see it as a worldwide environmental database that is used for some companies to score and to do a self-assessment on their sustainability journey, but also to disclose this information to third party because they might be interested. They might be clients, investors, or suppliers. So now I'm going to talk about the CSRD, which is, there are many acronyms, but this means Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And the context of the CSRD is the current non-financial reporting directive. So this is directive that exists before the CSRD and applies to companies with more than 500 employees and that are considered public interest entities in Europe. For example, listed companies or credit institutions, insurance companies, or other companies that member states of the European Union consider as public interest entities. So their report, it was all about environmental matters, but also human rights, anti-corruption and bribery, and diversity in management and supervisory bodies. So in this context, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the main objective of this directive is to replace and improve the non-financial reporting directive, trying to have more comparability and transparency in sustainability reporting. I don't know if you are familiar or not with this directive, but it's becoming quite trendy in Europe because the scope is larger than before. So now all the companies that meet 2 of the following criteria, they will be under the CSRD, which are companies with at least 250 employees, 40 million euros of turnover, or 20 million euros of total assets. Also, the CSRD will later on apply to small and medium enterprises and also to non-EU companies, which are the parent company of companies in Europe. We will see the details later on because that might impact perhaps some US companies that you know. So the CSRD will use a set of standards that are called European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And then the European Commission has allowed a lighter reporting for the first year for those companies with less than 750 employees, because they realize it's really a lot. There's a lot to report, and they wanted to have lighter reporting. So if we have a look at the application calendar, we see that for the next financial year, 2024, the companies that were already subject to the non-financial reporting directive, they will need to report and submit their reports in 2025. Then during the financial year 2025, the CSRD will apply to those companies considered as large companies which were not already subject to non-financial reporting directive, with their reports due in 2026. There will be a period where small and medium enterprises can opt out until 2028, but then they will need to report with certain set of standards which have involved lighter reporting. And later on, during financial year 2028, with reports due in 2029, the CSRD would also apply to non-EU companies, which are the parent company with a turnover of more than 150 million euros, and which has a EU large or listed subsidiary or a EU subsidiary or branch with more than 40 million euros turnover. So we see a clear direct impact on certain EU companies that is coming. There's a little bit of time to adapt, but that will be the direct impact of the CSRD. There is also an indirect impact that we will see later. So I could talk about the CSRD for hours, but I wanted to show you in an helicopter view a little bit all the information that companies under the scope need to disclose under the CSRD if it's material for their activity. Just to give you an idea, not only what they have to report, but also what other countries might also include in their environmental legislations in the future, in the US or in other countries or elsewhere. So the CSRD applies to actually the disclosures are about general disclosures, and then environmental, social, and governance. So about environmental information, companies need to disclose about water and marine resources, about pollution, about climate change, obviously, about biodiversity and ecosystems, circular economy. When it comes to social information, they need to disclose information about their own workforce, but also about the workers in the value chain, about the affected communities, and about consumers and end users. And about governance information, they need to disclose the business conduct, what is their approach to corruption and bribery, the management of relationship with suppliers, including payment practices. But I would like to go just to show you a little bit more into detail the part of climate change, because within each of this blog, there is a lot of disclosures to share as an obligation as part of the CSRD. So if we dig into the climate change part, we see that companies only to disclose information about the climate change part, they need to share what is the transition plan for climate change mitigation, what material impact, risk, and opportunities they have identified, and what is their interaction with their strategy and business model, what policies and actions they are implementing related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And there is also another part which is more quantitative information, metrics and targets. So companies need to disclose the popular scopes 1, 2, and 3, the total greenhouse gas emissions of the company, but also other potential financial effects associated to the material risk and transition risk. And this is only for climate change, so we can imagine how much work this is going to take for EU companies. What is the impact for US firms in the end? Well, the thing is, like EU companies, they need to report on scope 1, 2, and 3. And as we have seen now with Frederick, there is this part in scope 3 that is really related to suppliers. So EU companies are likely to, I'm going to start engaging with their suppliers. They are going to look at their supply chains because they will need to report on those emissions, and they want to provide information that is accurate, the most accurate possible. And also with the time, they will want to reduce those emissions. So there is a lot of relationship and engagement with suppliers that has to do with CSRD and this shared CO2 emissions between the reporting company and the supplier. When the CSRD is linked in a way to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is still on a phase of a proposal. But it's very interesting because it goes a little bit further and it says, okay, now you have to identify, prevent, and mitigate negative human rights and environmental impacts resulting from your business practices, and you have to have your business strategies aligned with the Paris Agreement obligations, which is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Then for the scope, the CSDDD will apply to companies that are larger, but will apply to companies that are in the EU and also to third country companies, which might be from the US, will have a turnover of 150 million euros, or with turnover between 40 million euros and 150 million euros in certain sectors, like considered more vulnerable sectors for the environment and for the human rights. What is interesting about these proposals is that it includes a director's duty of care on sustainability matters, directly engaging the directors and high management to review the sustainability practices of the company and the way they integrate ACG factors in their business strategy. And there is also a component of civil liability. So companies are liable for damages if their appropriate measures are not put in place to remediate those negative consequences for third parties. So the proposal of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive will have also an indirect or direct impact for US firms in the way that companies within the scope, let's say like EU companies, that will be required to establish due diligence procedures on ACG aspects along their value chains. So they are, of course, going to look at the suppliers they work with, not only in Europe, but elsewhere. And they have an obligation, actually, to identify, to prevent, to mitigate these negative human rights and environmental impacts, but in their value chains, but inside and outside Europe. Because they have to develop a plan to ensure that the business strategy is compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement, is one of the main points of the CSDDD. They will demand their suppliers to really to reduce their emissions, and one step for their suppliers to reduce their emissions is first to start knowing what their emissions are and having a knowledge about it. So EU companies are more likely to use partners that are in control and can manage their emissions. Also, because it will involve the responsibility of directors of EU companies that they have to implement these due diligence procedures into their company strategy. This is part of their interest as well to be involved in the supply chains assessment. I would like to talk also about the EU ETS because I will talk later about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this serves as a very good introduction. So in case you don't know, an emission trading system, in general, it works like a major carbon market, which is based on the cap and trade system. That's the EU ETS in particular. Other systems work differently. So there is a cap on the number of emission allowances that can be issued on that carbon market, which covers the total volume of the greenhouse gas emission that can be emitted at the EU level overall. Then there is a number of actually these carbon emissions give companies the right to emit 1 ton of CO2. So the European Union distributes freely some of those emission allowances for industries which are in the more vulnerable sectors, and the rest of the carbon emissions, they are traded. They are buy and sold within this market. And the idea, of course, is to reduce the number of emission allowances over time in order to reduce also the overall emissions of the EU. That's how the EU ETS system works, which is relevant for what I'm going to explain to you later. Actually, there are other emission trading systems around the world, and because it works like the carbon market, it is based on the demand and offer principles, and the prices changes every day. So, for example, right now, carbon permits are reaching 100 euros per ton in Europe, and there are different prices in the ETS markets in other countries around the world, if they exist. When looking at the US, for example, we see that there are some emission trading systems which are in force already. They might be similar or not to the EU ETS, but they are considered ETS systems as well. There are others which are under consideration. So in force, they will be in California and Oregon, Washington, and Massachusetts. They are also under consideration in other states and under development. So this is very relevant as well for the carbon adjustment mechanism, because they are going to look at other countries and they are going to see if they have ETS that is similar to the EU ETS system. So this is the famous carbon border adjustment mechanism. Indeed, that's what it wants. Like the European Union is saying, okay, we are applying very strict environmental regulations, and there is a risk that some of our production is going to move to other countries where the regulations are not that strict. And they want to ensure that is an equal treatment for those products made in the EU and those products imported from outside the European Union, to avoid what is called carbon leakage. That is precisely like companies moving somewhere else to pollute and to emit their emissions outside the European Union. So the scope of the CBAM, of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is really those products which are imported from outside the European Union, which are at high risk of carbon leakage, which at the moment are iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminium, electricity generation, and hydrogen. So all the companies, US companies that in a way produce or these kind of products and they trade with the European Union, they will be impacted, and I will tell you how. So regarding the application deadline, actually the CBAM, this adjustment mechanism in the border, started in October this year, and it has an initial phase. During the first initial phase, which lasts 2 years, the EU importers, because it applies to EU importers only, they will need to report on these greenhouse gas emissions from the goods imported from outside the European Union. In the beginning, they can use default values because, of course, not all the suppliers, not all the non-EU producers know their emissions embed in the products they produce. But later on, they will need to report, they will need to follow a EU methodology to report on those emissions, and because default values might be higher than actual values, the EU importers, they would like to know and engage with suppliers that, again, know how to track and measure their emissions, and in this case of the products they produce. So from January 2026, there will be a new phase, and in this new phase, there will be a financial impact. And this is where the CBAM becomes relevant from an economic point of view, in the sense that EU importers, they will need to purchase CBAM certificates to cover those embedded emissions of the goods they have imported from outside the European Union. Also, we have to consider that in the future, it is expected that the CBAM will apply to other products as well. So then it will broaden the scope. So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, actually, it applies to those products imported from countries that do not have an ETS system that is similar to the EU ETS. So if the product comes from a country that is already subject to carbon pricing, and the producer has already paid for this carbon pricing, that they use says, okay, then it's fine, then the product can be imported, it's a fair treatment, it's a fair rule. So that's why having a system similar to the EU ETS, it really makes the difference of the financial impact for those products. So in the end, what is the impact for EU companies and for non-EU producers like US companies? From EU companies importing outside the European Union, they will have reporting obligations. They will have to report on the greenhouse gas emissions from those goods imported from outside the European Union, but they will also have to buy certificates to cover those emissions of imported goods. They're following the EU ETS pricing. So they will do a weekly average of the daily price, and they will have to buy certificates at that price. And they will also have an impact on non-EU producers in the way that they will have to provide information on the greenhouse gas emissions from those products sold to EU importers. And it will be in their advantage, really, to decrease the CO2 emissions to gain the market and attract EU importers. Again, is another way how the EU companies are going to assess their supply chains worldwide. So in conclusion, impact of EU environmental laws goes beyond the EU jurisdiction. because applies to foreign companies that have business in Europe, but also because indirectly it is going to affect the whole supply chain from EU firms. So that puts pressure on foreign companies. Other countries and states around the globe are likely to follow EU regulations. So it's also good maybe to look at what the EU is doing, to have a little bit of time in advance to prepare and to comply with something that might come to other countries and states. And I see a little bit of a resemblance of what happened in 2018 when the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was adopted. That I remember that at the time in the following years, it was perceived the GDPR as a high standard of privacy and data protection. And actually I was working in Australia for the last years. I have been working there, and there were US companies who were with employees based in Australia who were asking my previous company, we were GDPR compliant because they were seeing that as a high standard of privacy and data protection indeed. So I think it will happen in a way the same with sustainability. So Europe is leading the sustainability journey, and in a way other countries might follow, and they are already actually doing a big effort to put sustainability laws in place. So the conclusion for me is really because these pressures are coming from EU firms, the best way to manage, reduce, and track greenhouse gas emissions is to perform a carbon footprint assessment after all, to be ahead of these market pressures, to comply with Paris obligations, and to be able to respond to those questions that will come, like any other due diligence on cybersecurity, on other matters. And then I come back to the slide that we mentioned before. When performing a carbon footprint, of course, we have to cover the 3 scopes. There are different environmental laws in the US or in other countries but maybe they focus only by now on scope 1 and scope 2. But it's important to measure the 3 scopes because that will come at some point, and it's already a requirement in Europe, for example. In our case, how can D-Carbonize can help to comply with this regulation? Actually, with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, we can measure scope 1 and 2 and 3. We can help with the metrics, with the targets, with all the quantitative information. Again, also, we can do that for the TCFD and for the CDP reporting. With the CBAM, we can help with the measurement of the greenhouse gas emissions per imported product, doing a carbon footprint per product, and really analyzing and using the EU methodology to calculate the emissions. And for the EU ETS, of course, there's also a part of calculation emissions for fuel release that I didn't mention the EU ETS too, because I could go 4 hours about all the revision and new laws about the EU ETS in particular. Also, I would like to mention the next webinars that we have. They are at EU time, 1 p.m. EU time. So maybe only for those of you who are based in Europe. But we are going to go into detail about how to manage CSRD reporting obligations. We will also talk about how to implement a good carbon reduction strategy and how to become a good ACG manager and the skills that you need to succeed in this role. And then I would like to give the word to Frederick, who will be in New York City, actually, very soon.
Yes. Thank you very much, Iris, for that. And indeed, at the end of November, I'll have the pleasure to travel to your wonderful country and city of New York City. So if you're around, let's meet. More than happy to meet. We will also organize a climate table. So it will be on Thursday, the 30th of November. Around 11:30 a.m. The tentative location should be next to the United Nations at our Consulate General of Belgium, but this is to be confirmed. But that being said, you're most welcome, and we will follow up with each one of you if you would like to attend to this climate table. It's a very small format, intimate, where we will drill down into your challenges, barriers to decarbonize your activities, and we will go into much details about what is a carbon footprint assessment. So now I guess it's time to open the floor for questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Already, thank you very much for those of you who sent some questions before the webinar. We tried to answer them as much as we could with the content, but there are some of them that we can answer. But first, Florence, I think you have one question. This is for you, Iris. Who do you buy the CBAM certificates from?
The CBAM certificates.
That's
a good question. Yeah, indeed. The CBAM, I mean, I don't know from which authority in particular. There will be a CBAM national registry where companies have to report their emissions, and actually they have to quarterly they have to report on those emissions, and yearly they have to buy the CBAM certificates. So I guess it will be, because they are still putting everything in place. During the first 2 years, there is only the obligation to report. There is not an obligation to purchase the certificates yet. So I don't know from which authority in particular you will need to buy them. And I don't know if this authority has been defined yet, to be honest, because after the provisional period of 2 years, the European Union is collecting all the data on the reports, and they will adopt some implemented acts to decide the further details about the definitive period, what the purchases need to be purchased. The certificates need to be purchased.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, Florence. So we have another question. Can you share what this means for mining firms? So maybe, Prachi, if you could a little bit specify your questions here, but what I can give you some example of that we have with current customers right now. So mining firms are usually held by large investment funds, right? There is a more precision. What do mining firms need to do to report emissions, safety, etc., because they release Scope 3 emission? Yeah.
It will be related to CBAM, perhaps, not for
primary products.
For primary product, yeah. So then for everything, like they will need to conduct a carbon footprint assessment. So that's something that we can do. For example, if your question is related to CBAM in particular, there is EU method to follow that is quite, I would not say complicated, it's quite technical. So there are different phases to report. So I cannot really explain it in 2 minutes. But then, for example, to report, to provide information to those companies reporting under CSRD, they will need to provide information on their full scope, if possible, to perform a carbon footprint assessment of their activity.
Yeah, and to add, Prachi, yes, indeed, folks like Volkswagen or car manufacturers, they will care about the carbon emissions related to mining, because it's in their interest to reduce their CO2 emissions and to purchase products that are decarbonized. Looking at the other questions, we have one from Elena. My question is topic related. What are the most advanced carbon compensation mechanism technologies? This is a very good question, Elena. So I'm not quite sure that we will go in depth into the answer of that question, because right now everything that is around carbon offset and compensation is a bit touchy. It's a bit explosive. If you want to know our opinion, we prefer to work with our customers to help them to reduce their CO2 emissions effectively and guide them to the best that we can in a transparent way about some compensation project. But right now it's a bit of an explosive topic if you read the press. Yes. David, there is one question from David. With respect to Scope 3, to what extent does the ESRS give companies subject to the CSRD flexibility in reporting based on averages and assumptions, or otherwise be excused from reporting Scope 3 based on the lack of data?
I mean, the CSRD will follow likely the greenhouse gas protocol, and I mean, as they are not going to control the results of your carbon footprint assessment for now. There might be later that they will ask companies to compare year after year, and they will put maybe an obligation to reduce their emissions. For now, it's about reporting. So it's not really, I mean, companies can cheat if they want in the reporting obligations, but we always recommend the more precision as possible if the company has that information. But it's true that in the first carbon footprint, they might not have that information. That's why we also encourage companies to start 1 year early or 2 years early than what they are obliged to, because then they might realize when they have to submit a report that is poorly report because they don't have the data, they don't have the information. And that is true that for now there is only an obligation to report emissions and not to reduce them, but we are seeing already with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, for example, where there is an obligation to align the business strategy to limit global warming. What this is starting really to put some pressure on the actions that the company is going to take to reduce those emissions.
Yes, exactly. And I think we have time for one more question if you have more in the audience. But we received a question via email that I really like. And the question is, when do you expect European companies to start engaging with their suppliers to comply with CSRD? And I guess behind this question is, when do you think that European companies will ask American companies to report their CO2 emissions?
Yeah, indeed. I think we always recommend companies, if you have to report, let's say in 2026, start already, because then you can have at least 1 or 2 carbon footprint assessments before, which are correct, which are precise. So the earlier the companies starts, EU companies start doing the carbon footprint assessment, they're more likely to start engaging with the suppliers. Because also when they realize, oh my God, our scope 3, this part is super large, how can we reduce it? They will look at the supply chain and they will, so it really depends on where they are in the application calendar within the scope of the CSRD, but we are expecting EU companies to comply earlier the application date, so to start talking about US firms very soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Iris, for your expertise here. Thank you very much for you in the audience for attending this webinar today, for your attention, and also for your very interesting questions. Feel free to drop us a note if you have follow-up questions. We will follow up with you individually for the questions we haven't had the time today to answer. And yeah, hopefully we can see each other in New York City in a month from now. And in the meantime, take care and think about measuring your CO2 emissions. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.